Hey, what's going on, APUSH peeps? We have the 7 years, also known as the French and Indian War, as a turning point. We're continuing with our turning point series, which could be potential essay topics, so make sure you are familiar with it. All right, before we begin, it's shout out time. I need to give a shout outs to Mr. Wanstrath's class in Loveland, Ohio, next to the wonderful Cincinnati, Mr. Liebernek's class in California, and Mr. Melamai's class in Hawaii. So cool. Someday I hope to go to your state. That is on the top of my bucket list, but I'm afraid of flying, so I'll figure it out someday. All right, best of luck to all of you. So the 7 Years' War, let's do a quick recap of what it was. It was a war between Britain and her colonists, and the French and many Native American tribes. So on one side you have Britain and the colonies, on the other you have the French and many Native Americans. And it took place between 1754 and 1763. You math experts will notice that that's 9 years. The first 2 years really were kind of undeclared, so that's why it's called the 7 Years' War. The British win the war, and France is removed from North America. And if you take a look at this map, you'll notice all this pink here. This is what the British will gain. So the British were really just, for the most part, limited to the 13 colonies here in North America on the East Coast, and they expand drastically all the way over to the Mississippi River, and France is essentially removed from North America. So is this a victory for the colonists? We'll find out, because that's why this is a turning point. Okay, so key ideas before the war. British colonists sought to expand into the Ohio River Valley. That will be a key throughout American history, is that colonists and Americans are going to want to expand out west. George Washington will make his way to near present-day Pittsburgh, and that will start off the French and Indian War with the French. The Albany Plan of Union was Ben Franklin's plan to unite the colonies, and this is where he creates the first political cartoon in American history, Join or Die, and this ultimately is rejected by colonial legislatures and the British. So this does not actually come to fruition. Salutary neglect is the most important idea before the war. This is Britain's lax policy towards the colonies. They really would leave the colonies alone as long as they were profitable. So they kind of like took a hands-off approach. They're like, you guys can just chill over in North America, do your thing, as long as you were generally following British laws and you're profitable. Okay, let's talk about 1763. This is a very important year, and I will give you an acronym to remember it. I want you to think PEEP, P-E-E-P. So the first P is going to be Pontiac's Rebellion, led by Chief Pontiac. This was a Native American rebellion in the Ohio and Michigan areas against British colonial expansion. So this is after the French and Indian War, and they're going to resent the British colonists trying to encroach onto their land, so they will lead a rebellion. Also in the year we had ended the 7 Years' War, again, Britain defeats the French and they gain land to the Mississippi River. End of salutary neglect. Everybody started this right now. It is that important. After the 7 Years' War, Britain ends its policy of salutary neglect. They do so because they are in massive war debt and they begin to take a more hands-on approach with the colonies. The final P in PEEP is the Proclamation Line of 1763, and this forbade colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And this infuriated colonists because they just won all this land in the 7 Years' War, but they weren't allowed to expand out west. So the first P, Pontiac's Rebellion, leads to the Proclamation Line of 1763, and the end of the 7 Years' War leads to the end of salutary neglect. Definitely know all four of these things. You should include them in any essay about the French and Indian War. Okay, let's jump to key ideas after the war. The relationship between Britain and the colonies drastically changed, and they did so for the worse. That sounds like a thesis statement to me. And they did so because Great Britain is in debt. They end salutary neglect, and the colonists resist new British acts. They don't like the British taking a more hands-on approach. For example, the Proclamation Line, which forbid westward expansion beyond the Appalachians, some colonists ignored and moved out west anyway. The Stamp Act, which was a tax on 50 different goods, the colonists reacted by forming the Stamp Act Congress, which they would boycott these goods, and they would also tar and feather tax collectors, and the British would end up repealing the Stamp Act. For the Tea Act, in which the British had a tax on tea, the colonists were infuriated, so some participated in the Boston Tea Party, which threw hundreds of chests of tea into the Boston harbor. Britain responded with intolerable acts, which shut down the port of Boston and did other things. And the colonists responded with the First Continental Congress. So every British action, there is a colonial reaction to it. Now, a very important note, if you're writing an essay about the relationship between the British and the colonists, it's really not until 1776 that most colonists wanted independence. Really, throughout the early 1770s, they did not want independence. They saw themselves as British subjects. They just wanted to go back to the pre-1763 days of salutary neglect. Okay, so how was this war a turning point? Well, some things that changed. You have the end of salutary neglect. This really, truly is everything in your essay, so make sure you talk about it. You have the emergence of a colonial unity against the British. So the colonists are uniting in their hatred and dislike of the British. You have things like the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress. And the treatment of American soldiers during the war, they could only be promoted so far. So George Washington was limited in how far he could be promoted during the French and Indian War. And that angered a lot of Americans simply because they were Americans. They were not being promoted further. So some continuities or things that remain the same. Well, throughout this, colonists viewed themselves as British. Even though there's a unique American identity emerging, they still viewed themselves as British. Most colonists did not want independence, again, until 1776. And when we're talking about possible synthesis points here, you could connect the 7 Years' War to a direct cause of the American Revolution, or you could divide up an essay into social, economic, and political categories. Either one of those would get you your oh-so-important synthesis point. All right, for some test tips for multiple choice and short answer, definitely know the impacts of the war on the colonists. Be able to identify different acts, whether it's a Stamp Act, a proclamation line, etc. Be able to identify those as an excerpt for multiple choice questions, and be able to identify and describe colonial responses to the British government, things like loyalists and patriots. How did each respond to different acts? And for essays, analyzing the war as a turning point in colonial history. That is so important. AP has asked that many times in recent years. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please do check out my playlist on turning points. Best of luck on your exam in May. You will do great on your essays and multiple choice. And thank you very much for your support and watching. I do appreciate it. Have a good day.